A wooden gavel cracked down on a pine table. A woman flinched on the platform. A buckskin-coated stranger stopped dead in the middle of the muddy street. His left hand went to a leather pouch hanging under his beard. His right hand rested on the stock of a long Hawken rifle. 50 men were crowded in front of that platform. None of them noticed him yet. The auctioneer was shouting numbers. The woman on the boards had rope around her wrists and no shoes on her feet. A scar ran down her left cheek. She was looking at the sky, not the men. Not because she was proud, because she could not hear a single word any of them said. The stranger took one slow step forward. His name was Caleb Hollis. He had not spoken a word in 18 years. He was about to speak too. Stay with me on this one. The town was called Stillwater Bend. It sat in a bend of a creek that almost never moved, on the eastern foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Range, in the Colorado Territory, in the late summer of 1882. There was one street. There was one saloon. There was a freight office, a livery, a courthouse the size of a tool shed, and a set of gallows nobody had bothered to take down after the last hanging in July. Behind the freight office somebody had built a rough wooden platform out of fresh pine boards, and somebody else had nailed red bunting around the edges, the same red bunting they used at the county fair. Now here's the thing. They were not selling cattle on that platform. They were not selling land. They were selling a woman's contract. That was a legal phrase used out west in those years. A contract sale. It meant a person owed somebody money, or had been declared a public nuisance, or had been ruled unfit by a territorial judge, and the local marshal had been granted the right to sell the debt off to whoever would pay. Whoever bought the contract owned the work, and the keeping of that person for a stated number of years. It was not slavery, the lawyer said. It was, the lawyer said, an arrangement. The woman on the platform had been declared a debtor, a witness of dubious character, and a danger to public morals. All in one afternoon. All by the same judge. All for a fee of $40 paid by her dead husband's older brother. Her name was Eleanor Ashby. Everybody called her Nora. She was 26. She had been deaf since she was 9. A childhood fever had taken her hearing in a single week, and she had learned to read lips from her father, a Union sergeant who had come back from the war thinner than a fence rail and twice as quiet. She had married young. Her husband had drowned in a stock pond the second year. His older brother, a cattle buyer named Hollister Ashby, had moved into the house the day after the funeral and never moved out. 3 weeks before the auction, the Ashby barn had burned to the ground. 18 head of cattle gone. The insurance man had come out from Denver to investigate. Hollister Ashby had stood on the porch and pointed at Nora and said the words slow enough for her to read his lips. He said she had done it. He said she had set the fire because she was sick in the head. He said she had been writing letters to a dead man for years, and that was proof enough she was not right. He was lying about the fire. He had said it himself. He had needed the insurance money. He had needed Nora gone because she had seen him do it. Now Nora stood on a pine platform with rope on her wrists. The auctioneer was a man named Silas Pratt who chewed tobacco and wore a derby hat. The marshal, a heavy man named Vance Cobb, leaned against the rail with a brass star on his vest and a bottle in his coat. The bidders were ranchers, miners, 2 timber bosses, and Hollister Ashby himself, standing front and center in a long black coat, smiling the way a man smiles when he already knows the ending. The bidding opened at $20. It climbed to $30. A widow named Mee Whitcomb, who ran the boarding house at the end of the street, raised her hand at $32. Hollister Ashby raised his at $35. Mee went to $38. Hollister went to $40. Mee lowered her hand. She had nothing left. Silas Pratt raised his gavel. He said going once. He said going twice. That was when the buckskin-coated stranger stepped out of the crowd. He did not raise his hand. He did not say a word. He simply walked forward through the men, slow and steady, and he stopped at the foot of the platform. His coat was old. His beard was gray. His eyes were the color of pale river ice. A long scar ran across his throat just under the jaw. 40 silver dollars hung in a leather pouch around his neck. Silas Pratt looked at him. The crowd looked at him. Hollister Ashby looked at him, and the smile slid off his face by a quarter inch. The auctioneer asked the stranger his bid. The stranger did not answer. The auctioneer asked again, louder. The stranger lifted his eyes to the woman on the platform. He looked at the scar on her cheek. He looked at the silver locket hanging on a thin chain around her neck. He looked at the rope on her wrists. His mouth worked for a long moment, like a man trying to remember how to use a tool he had set down a long time ago. Then he spoke. His voice came out cracked and torn, and so quiet the men in the back row stopped breathing to hear it. He said 3 words, not 2. He said, "I'll take her." The platform went silent. Hollister Ashby's hand moved 1 inch toward the pearl handle of the Colt under his coat. The marshal straightened up off the rail. Silas Pratt looked down at the stranger like a man looking at a ghost. He asked the stranger his name. The stranger lifted the leather pouch off his neck and set it on the pine boards. 40 silver dollars spilled out across the wood. Then he reached into the inside of his buckskin coat and pulled out a bundle of folded paper, tied with a piece of fishing line. The paper was yellow at the edges. There were a lot of pages. He set the bundle of letters next to the silver. He looked at Nora Ashby for the first time directly. And he spoke again, slower this time and louder. He said, "My name is Caleb Hollis. Sergeant Thomas Ashby of the Pennsylvania 48th carried me 3 miles off the field at Cold Harbor in 1864 with a bayonet still in my throat. He asked me one thing before he died of fever 2 months later. He asked me to find his daughter Eleonora if anything ever happened to him. I have been writing her letters for 18 years. I never sent them. I am taking her now." He picked up the silver. He picked up the letters. He did not pick up the rope. And the woman on the platform, who had not heard a single word of any of it, watched his lips move and read every word. And for the first time in 3 weeks, she did not look at the sky. She looked at him. The crowd stayed quiet for 10 long seconds. A horse stamped in the livery. A wagon creaked somewhere down the street. Hollister Ashby's hand stayed 1 inch from the pearl handle of his Colt. The marshal looked at Hollister. Hollister looked at the marshal. Some small thing passed between them that none of the rest of the crowd caught. Silas Pratt cleared his throat. He said the bid was 40 silver dollars, and the bid was accepted. He said the contract was sold to Caleb Hollis of the High Country for a term of 7 years. He brought the gavel down hard on the pine table. He gave Caleb the paper. Caleb folded the paper into his coat. He climbed the 3 steps onto the platform. He took out a clasp knife. He cut the rope off Nora's wrists in 1 slow pull. He put the knife away. He did not touch her. He held out his open hand the way a man holds out his hand to a horse that does not know him yet. Nora looked at the hand. She looked at his face. She looked at the silver locket around her own neck. Then she put her hand in his. He led her down off the platform and through the crowd. Men stepped back. Nobody said a word. They walked the length of the muddy street, the buckskin coat and the gray homespun dress, the long rifle and the bare feet. They walked past the saloon and past the livery and past the gallows. They walked to the boarding house at the end of the street, and Mee Whitcomb opened the door before they reached it. Mee took 1 look at Nora's bare feet. She took 1 look at Caleb's face. She did not ask a single question. She closed the door behind them, and she shot the bolt, and she walked them through to the kitchen at the back. She set a tin tub on the floor near the stove. She poured hot water into it from a kettle. She handed Nora a bar of soap and a towel that smelled like lavender. Nora looked at the soap like she had not seen one in a year, which she had not. She washed the dust off her feet. She washed her hands. She washed the rope marks off her wrists. She did not cry. She did not speak. Deaf people who have lived a long time around hearing, people learn very young not to make sounds they cannot control. Caleb stood by the back window with his rifle leaned against the wall. He watched the alley behind the house. He watched the cottonwood trees. He watched the back gate of the livery. He did not turn around once while Nora washed. When she was done, Me sat her at the kitchen table and put a bowl of stew in front of her and a tin cup of well water. Me set a second bowl in front of Caleb. He sat down across from Nora. He took off his beaver fur hat for the first time since he had walked into town. He set the hat on the bench. He set the rifle across his knees. He picked up the cup. He drank. Nora picked up her cup. She drank. For 10 long minutes the kitchen was warm and silent and safe. The stove ticked. The kettle hissed. A fly walked across the windowsill. Caleb set his cup down. Nora set her cup down. She lifted her hand from the table, slow and careful, and she touched the back of his hand with 2 fingers just once. Then she pulled her hand back into her lap. It was, in that small kitchen, the most peaceful 10 minutes Caleb Hollis had spent in 18 years. Then somebody knocked on the back door. Not the front. The back. And it was not Me's knock. Caleb stood up. He picked up the rifle. He moved Nora behind him with one hand, fast, the way a man moves a child away from a snake. Me's face went white. She picked up an iron poker from the stove and held it like a club. The knock came again. Then a voice through the wood. The voice belonged to Hollister Ashby. He said, "Open up." He said this was a legal matter. He said the marshal had reviewed the contract and found a flaw. He said the bid was being recalled. He said if Caleb opened the door peaceably, no one would be hurt. He said if Caleb did not open the door, the marshal had 8 deputized men in the alley with rifles. Caleb listened. He did not move. Nora watched his face. She could not hear Hollister. She could see Caleb's jaw tight and untighten 3 times in a row. She put her hand on the small of his back. She left it there. If you are still with me on this one, hit that subscribe button. It tells me you want the rest of these. The story is just getting to the part that matters. Caleb leaned the rifle against the wall. He stepped to the back window and lifted the curtain 1 inch with his finger. He counted. There were not 8 men in the alley. There were 4. 2 of them were holding rifles. 2 of them were holding kerosene cans. One of those 4 was Marshal Vance Cobb. Kerosene. Believe me when I tell you that detail mattered. They had not come to take Nora back. They had come to burn the boarding house with everybody inside it. Hollister Ashby was not bargaining. He was buying time at the door while the marshal's men got the kerosene poured against the back wall. After the fire, there would be no contract to argue about. There would be no witness to the burned barn. There would be 1 mountain hermit and 1 deaf woman and 1 widow, all dead in a kitchen fire, and a frontier town that would shake its head and bury them and move on by Sunday. Caleb turned around. He looked at me. He pointed at the cellar door. Me nodded. She knew the layout of her own house. There was a coal chute that came up under the woodpile 20 feet behind the back fence. She had used it 3 winters running. Caleb took Nora's hand. He pulled her gently to the cellar door. He lifted the trap. He lowered her down the ladder. He went down after her. Me came last and dropped the trap door behind her. The cellar smelled like potatoes and dry earth. There was 1 lantern on a nail. Me did not light it. She did not need to. She crossed to the coal chute, lifted the iron grate and pushed Nora through first. Caleb came next. Me came last. They came up under the woodpile in the side yard, behind the back fence, in the long shadow of a cottonwood tree. From the alley on the other side, they could hear a match strike. Then the soft cough of kerosene catching. Then the deeper crackle of pine boards starting to burn. Me did not look back at her boarding house. She walked them 3 blocks east through alleys to the livery, and she paid the stable boy $2 silver not to remember them, and she put Caleb on a tall buckskin gelding and Nora behind him with her arms around his waist, and she handed up a wool blanket and a sack of biscuits and a tin canteen of water. Me looked at Caleb one last time. She said one thing. She said the high pass at Lost Saddle is your only way. She said the marshal will set the road north and the road south. She said go straight up. She said the snow there is 2 feet even in August, and the air thin enough to kill a city horse. She said, but the marshal will not follow you up. She said nobody follows a mountain man up his own mountain. Caleb touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. He turned the buckskin west. He rode out of the back of the livery at a slow walk so as not to draw the eye, and he rode through the cottonwoods along the dry creek, and when he was out of sight of the town, he kicked the horse up to a trot, and then to a canter, and then to a steady mile-leading lope. Behind them, a column of black smoke climbed over Stillwater Bend. The kitchen, the back room, the front parlor, all of it gone in 20 minutes. They rode for 4 hours into the foothills before Caleb pulled the horse up. The sun was getting low. Nora had not made one sound. He helped her down. He sat her on a flat rock. He took out the canteen and put it in her hands. She drank a swallow. She handed it back. He drank a swallow. He handed it back. She drank again. He looked at her bare feet. They were bleeding in 2 places. He took the wool blanket off the back of the saddle. He cut 2 long strips off the edge with his clasp knife. He knelt in front of her on one knee, the way a man kneels in front of a horse that is hurt. He held up the strips. He waited. He did not move closer until she nodded. Then he wrapped her feet slow and tight, one at a time. He did not touch any part of her except the foot in his hand. When he was done, he tied off the second knot. He stood up. He stepped back. She looked at her wrapped feet. She looked at him. She did something then that surprised him. She smiled. It was a small smile. It was the first smile she had given anybody since the day the barn burned. It did not last long. But Caleb saw it. And he tucked it away, somewhere inside him, in the same place where he had tucked away the daguerreotype of the 9-year-old girl her father had shown him in a hospital tent 18 years before. He pulled the bundle of letters out of his coat. He set them in her lap. He pointed at the letters and then at her. He waited. She untied the fishing line with hands that shook only a little. She unfolded the top letter. It was dated June 12, 1864. It was addressed to Miss Eleanor Ashby, Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It was 3 pages long. It started with the words, "Your father saved my life this morning, and I cannot speak to tell him so, but I can write to you." Nora read the first letter. Then the second. Then the third. There were 51 letters in the bundle. The sun went down behind the peaks. Caleb built a small fire of dry sage and aspen twigs. He set water to boil in a tin cup. He did not look at her face while she read. He gave her the dignity of reading alone. When she was halfway through the bundle, she stopped. She folded the letter she was holding. She set it on top of the others. She stood up. She walked the 4 steps to where Caleb was sitting by the fire. She knelt in front of him. She put both her hands on either side of his face. She looked into his pale river-ice eyes. And she did not say a word, because she had never said a word, but her face said every word her father would have said if her father had lived long enough to thank the man he carried off the field at Cold Harbor. Caleb's eyes filled up. He let them. He did not look away. They rode through the night with Nora's arms tight around his waist. The trail climbed. The trees thinned to scrub pine and then to bare rock. By dawn they were above the timber line, and the air was so thin Caleb could hear his own heart in his ears. The buckskin labored. He got down and led the horse on foot. Nora climbed down without being asked and walked beside him. Her bare feet were wrapped now in strips torn from the wool blanket, the way Caleb had wrapped them at the second rest stop. At the top of Lost Saddle Pass, in the cold gray light just after dawn, Caleb stopped the horse and turned around. They could see 30 miles down the eastern slope. They could see the thin line of the wagon road. They could see, halfway up the road, a column of riders coming on, 10 or 12 of them, with the brass glint of a star at the head. The marshal was following after all. Hollister Ashby had paid for that too. Caleb watched the column for a long minute. He looked at Nora. He pointed at the snowfield ahead of them, and then at the ridgeline beyond it. He pointed at himself and made a walking motion with 2 fingers, and then a stopping motion. He pointed at her and made the walking motion and pointed at the ridgeline. He was telling her to go on. He was going to stop. Nora shook her head. Once. Hard. He pointed at her again. She shook her head again. She took the rifle off his shoulder. She looked at it for a moment, this woman who had probably never fired a long gun in her life, and then she handed it back to him. She took his hand. She put it on her chest over her heart so that he could feel her heart beating. She put her own hand on his chest. She kept it there until she felt his heart beat. Then she pointed at the ridgeline and made the walking motion with 2 fingers, and she pointed at both of them together. She was telling him, "We go together or we stop together." Caleb closed his eyes for one long second. He opened them. He nodded. They did not stop on the pass. They went down the western slope. Halfway down, in a notch between 2 granite walls, Caleb pulled the horse off the trail and into a stand of scrub pine, and he tied the horse to a root, and he set Nora behind a boulder with the canteen and the blanket. He took the Hawken. He climbed up onto a flat rock above the trail. He lay down on his belly. He laid the Hawken across the rock. He waited. The marshal's column came up the trail 40 minutes later. They were tired. The horses were lathered. 2 men had already turned back, the way me had said they would. Marshal Cobb was at the front. Hollister Ashby was at the back, on a black mare, his pearl-handled Colt out and resting across his saddle horn. Caleb did not aim at the marshal. He aimed at the rock 6 feet ahead of the marshal's horse. He squeezed. The Hawken cracked. Stone chips flew. The horse reared. The marshal went off the back of his saddle hard onto the trail. 2 of the deputies wheeled their horses and started shooting wildly at the rocks above. Caleb reloaded. 45 seconds. He had done it 10,000 times. He fired again. This time he chose a deputy's saddle horn. The horn exploded in splinters, and the deputy turned his horse and rode back down the trail without looking back. 2 more followed him. The marshal scrambled to his feet, bleeding from his face where he had hit a rock, and screamed at the rest of the column. Only Hollister Ashby and 1 man stayed. Caleb reloaded. 45 seconds. Hollister Ashby kicked the black mare forward up the trail, alone, his Colt out in front of him, his eyes sweeping the rocks. He had figured out 3 days earlier that the mute mountain man buying winter supplies at the freight office was Caleb Hollies. He had set the auction specifically to draw Caleb down out of the mountains so he could kill them both at once. The fire at the boarding house had been the second piece of the same trap. This here on the trail was the third. He had not come for Nora. He had come for Caleb. Caleb stood up on top of the flat rock. He stood up in plain sight. He let Hollister see him. He let Hollister see the Hawken. And he spoke. For the 3rd time in 18 years. He said, "Sergeant Ashby's daughter is not your property." Hollister Ashby raised the Colt. Caleb fired the Hawken. The shot took Hollister Ashby clean through the right shoulder, exactly where Caleb had aimed it, and spun him off the black mare and dropped him in the trail. The Colt skidded 6 feet across the rock. Hollister Ashby lay on his back staring at the sky and breathing hard and not dying, because Caleb had decided, on the flat rock, that he was not going to be the one to kill him. The marshal stood up slow, with his hands open at his sides. The last deputy did the same. Caleb came down off the rock, with the Hawken reloaded and trained on the marshal's chest. He told the marshal 1 sentence. He said, "Carry him down. Tell the territorial judge in Pueblo what you did. Tell him about the barn. Tell him about the kerosene. or I will come down out of these mountains every spring for the rest of your life and tell him myself." The marshal nodded. He did not speak. He could not, because his jaw was already broken from the fall. Caleb walked back to the boulder. He held out his hand to Nora. She took it. They went back to the horse. They rode on west, over the second pass, down into the high green valley on the other side of the Sangre de Cristo, where Caleb Hollis had built a cabin 18 years before and lived alone in it the whole time. They reached the cabin 3 days later. It sat in a meadow above a clear creek, with chinked log walls and a sod roof and a stovepipe of beaten tin. A pair of mule deer watched them come in from the tree line. The horse drank from the creek. Caleb pushed open the door. Inside there was one iron bed against the back wall. There was a table of split pine. There was a black iron stove. There was a Union Scout's coat, blue with brass buttons, hanging on a peg by the door. And there were 2 carved wooden cups on the table, side by side, the way Caleb had set them out every morning for 18 years, even though no second person had ever sat in the second chair. Nora looked at the 2 cups. She looked at Caleb. She walked to the table. She picked up the second cup. She held it in both coat on the second peg, next to the Union coat. He turned around. Nora was standing by the stove with the cup still in her hand again, this time filled with cold creek water. She held it out to him. He took it. He drank. Then she touched his throat gently just under the jaw where the bayonet scar was. She traced it once with her finger. She did not flinch. She had her own scar across her left cheek. The 2 scars were not the same shape, but they were the same kind of thing. He set his hand over hers on his throat, and he kept it there. 18 years earlier, in the smoke and the screaming and the wet grass at Cold Harbor, a Pennsylvania sergeant had picked up a wounded scout he did not know, and had carried him 3 miles to a field hospital that could not save his voice, but did save his life. 2 months later, the sergeant had died of camp fever in a tent in Virginia, holding a daguerreotype of a 9-year-old girl who could not hear, and asking the silent scout in the next cot to find her one day. Today, in a meadow 1,800 miles west of that battlefield, the silent scout had paid the debt. He had carried the sergeant's daughter up a mountain instead of off one. He had used his voice for the first and last time he would ever use it. He had not used it for himself. He had used it for her. The fire in the iron stove was lit by Nora, with a striker she found in the drawer where Caleb had always kept it, as if she had always known where it would be. Smoke went up the beaten tin pipe and out into the high blue Colorado sky. The mule deer at the tree line went back to grazing. The buckskin gelding cropped grass by the creek. Inside the cabin, 2 wooden cups sat on a split pine table. Both of them, for the first time in 18 years, were full. Outside the door on the second peg, 2 coats hung side by side. A Union Scout's coat with brass buttons, and a long buckskin coat with a leather pouch hanging from the inside, empty now of silver but still holding, folded carefully against the lining, a bundle of 51 letters that had finally, after 18 long years, been delivered to the only person they had ever been meant for. The cabin door stayed closed. The smoke kept rising. And somewhere far below them, down the long western slope, the wind moved through the aspens with a sound that nobody in that cabin needed to hear to understand.